The Sisters' Betrayal, a family torn apart by deadly jealousy. Crime story. Rebecca Langston's life in Langston, Georgia, had always been predictable. The small town, nestled on the outskirts of the city, was the sort of place where everyone knew each other's names and children grew up playing in the same yards, attending the same schools. It was a town where secrets were difficult to keep, but where most people managed to live in peaceful coexistence, untouched by the chaos and complexities of the world beyond. Rebecca's world had always seemed like a picture of stability, a place where the noise and turmoil of the outside world could never reach her. She had married Tom Langston when she was just 23, in a simple ceremony at the local church. At the time, she was filled with optimism and belief in the kind of love that made people want to settle down in a quiet place like Langston, Georgia. After all, she had grown up in this very town, surrounded by the same people who now watched her marriage with pride. Her parents had been high school sweethearts, and their bond was one Rebecca had always admired. She expected nothing less for herself. The early years of their marriage had been blissful. Tom was a kind, hard-working man, and together they had built a life that many would have envied. Their small house, a cozy two-story home on the corner of Maple and 3rd, was their pride and joy. It had a well-kept lawn, a white picket fence, and a garden that Rebecca tended to religiously. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the smell of freshly baked bread and the sound of soft music playing in the background as Tom read the paper or watched a ball game on TV. Everything about their life together felt effortless, a comfortable rhythm that seemed unshakable. They had their daughter, Lily, 5 years into their marriage. Lily was the culmination of their love, their shared dream made manifest in a bright, curious child who had inherited her father's hazel eyes and her mother's smile. Rebecca took immense pride in Lily, and her days were spent in the company of the girl who made her world feel complete. She was the quintessential suburban mother, attending PTA meetings, hosting playdates, and running errands for her husband, who worked as a manager at the local car dealership. Life was simple, but it was good. For years, Rebecca had known nothing but peace in the rhythms of daily life. The local gossip, the small-town dynamics, the routine of church on Sundays, and quiet evenings with Tom, it was all she had ever wanted. She had friends, neighbors she would occasionally meet for coffee, and a steady, though uneventful, existence. Langston was a town where you didn't ask for much. It was enough to simply exist, to be part of a community that took comfort in familiarity. And Rebecca, ever the optimist, had believed that nothing could disrupt the peace she had created. But as the years passed, something inside her began to shift. It wasn't that Tom had changed in any overt way, at least not at first, but she began to notice small differences, tiny moments that, when added together, gave her a nagging feeling that something was wrong. Tom had always been a creature of habit. He went to work at the same time every day, came home for dinner, and was always in bed by 10. But recently, there had been a subtle shift. He had started staying later at the office. When Rebecca asked him about it, he would give vague answers, claiming that he was swamped with work or had a meeting that ran late. At first, she thought nothing of it. She trusted Tom. They had been married for over a decade, and though they had their disagreements, nothing had ever threatened their bond. Yet as the weeks turned into months, Rebecca's sense of unease grew. She found herself lying awake at night, listening to the sound of Tom's quiet breathing beside her, feeling a distance between them that she couldn't explain. She had always been attuned to the subtle changes in the world around her, a skill honed over years of raising a child and managing a household. It was in the way Tom no longer reached out to hold her hand during a movie, in the way his kisses had become more perfunctory, as if they were obligations rather than expressions of love. The small moments that once made her feel cherished now seemed absent, replaced by a silence that was almost too heavy to ignore. She tried to brush off the feelings, convincing herself that this was simply a phase. After all, Tom had been under stress at work lately. He had been talking about his manager position possibly being on the line, and with a mortgage to pay and a child to support, maybe the tension was getting to him. It made sense. But the more she told herself it was just work stress, the more the doubts crept in, as if her subconscious had already begun to whisper the truth long before she could hear it. It wasn't until one seemingly ordinary Thursday afternoon that Rebecca's suspicions were confirmed in the most unexpected way. She had been running errands in town, picking up groceries for the week, when she stopped by the post office to check the mail. Among the usual bills and junk mail was a letter addressed to Tom, with no return address. Curious, she slipped it into her purse and continued with her day. When she arrived home, she set the mail down on the kitchen counter and went about preparing dinner. It wasn't until after dinner, while Tom was in the shower, that she thought to open the letter. It felt strange, almost invasive, but a part of her couldn't resist. There was something about it that didn't sit right. Inside the envelope, she found a single sheet of paper with writing in a hand she didn't recognize. It was a love letter, a letter from someone named Chloe. The words were full of longing, filled with intimate details that made Rebecca's blood run cold. "I can't stop thinking about you," the letter began, "and I can't wait to see you again. I miss you more than you know." As she read the letter in its entirety, a deep sense of nausea settled in her stomach. The handwriting was unmistakable. Chloe, her sister. The woman Rebecca had known her whole life, the one she had laughed with over coffee, confided in during difficult times, and trusted without question. The world seemed to tilt around her. Her first thought was that it couldn't be true. It had to be some mistake, some cruel joke. But as her hands shook, she realized it wasn't a joke. This wasn't a figment of her imagination or a trick played on her by some malevolent force. Her sister, the person who had always stood by her side, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. She had been having an affair with Tom. Rebecca's heart felt like it had been torn out of her chest, shredded by the realization that the two people she loved most in the world had been lying to her, deceiving her behind her back. The house, once a sanctuary of love and family, now felt like a prison. Rebecca sat down on the kitchen floor, the letter crumpled in her hands, and tried to make sense of what she had just discovered. Chloe had always been there for her. They had shared everything: childhood memories, teenage heartbreaks, and even the secrets they kept from their parents. Chloe had been the one person Rebecca could always turn to, the one person she could trust without reservation. And now, in an instant, all of that had been shattered. Her sister had crossed a line that was unforgivable, and Tom, the man she had married, had betrayed her in a way that cut deeper than she could have ever imagined. Rebecca felt her world crumbling around her. The foundation of everything she had known to be true, her marriage, her family, her life, was now in ruins. In the days that followed, the house became a hollow shell. Rebecca moved through it like a ghost, unable to focus, unable to process the enormity of the betrayal she had discovered. Tom, when confronted, denied nothing. He offered no excuses, no apologies. In fact, his response was almost casual. "I'm sorry it had to come out this way, Rebecca," he had said. "But it just happened. It's been going on for a while now." The words were a dagger to her heart, cold and indifferent, as if their entire relationship meant nothing at all. Her sister's betrayal was bad enough, but Tom's reaction made it worse. He didn't seem to care. He didn't even seem to understand the gravity of what he had done. And that was when the anger truly began to take root. Rebecca could no longer stay silent. She could no longer pretend everything was fine. Her world had been shattered, and she needed to confront the people who had broken it, no matter the cost. The days following the discovery of the letter were a blur of disbelief and anger. Rebecca's entire sense of self had been shaken to its core. The life she had built, the family she had poured her heart and soul into, had been shattered. In the hours after reading the letter, she had sat in the kitchen, staring at the crumpled paper in her hands as if it were some kind of sick joke. Her thoughts spun wildly, but there was one question that kept resurfacing in her mind. Why? Her sister, Chloe, her confidant, her best friend, the one person in the world who should have had her back, had betrayed her. But it wasn't just that. It was the manner in which Chloe had done it. The affair had been going on for months, maybe longer. The pain of the deception wasn't simply in the act of infidelity. It was the realization that the woman she had trusted above all others had chosen to tear apart everything Rebecca had worked for, everything they had shared. For the next few days, Rebecca moved through the motions of life like a ghost. She went about her usual routines, cooking meals, taking care of Lily, handling the household. But all the while, her mind was consumed by the knowledge that Tom and Chloe had been lying to her for so long. It was like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The woman who had always prided herself on being calm, composed, and capable was no longer recognizable to herself. The quiet house felt foreign to her now. Where once it had been filled with laughter and love, it now seemed hollow, empty. The sound of Tom's footsteps no longer brought her comfort. Instead, it set her nerves on edge. She couldn't look at him without feeling a deep, visceral anger coursing through her veins. How could he have done this? How could he have betrayed her in such a deep, intimate way? The man she had given her life to, the man she had trusted with her heart, was no better than a stranger. Tom, for his part, seemed oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. He had always been the type to bury his emotions, to suppress his feelings rather than confront them. When Rebecca confronted him about the letter, he hadn't even looked guilty. There was no shame in his eyes, no remorse in his voice, just a dispassionate explanation that almost felt rehearsed. "I didn't want to hurt you, Rebecca," Tom had said, his tone oddly calm, as if they were discussing something trivial. "But it just happened. You know how it is. Things change. People change." Rebecca had stared at him, stunned by the lack of emotion in his words.
People change.
Was that all he had to say? Was that his excuse for throwing away their entire marriage, their entire family? She wanted to scream, to lash out at him, but she couldn't find the words. How could you express the depth of betrayal when the person standing in front of you was the one who had been part of it all? In the silence that followed, Tom had tried to hold her, to comfort her as though nothing had happened. But his touch felt like a violation. His arms around her, once a source of solace, now made her skin crawl. She pulled away, her heart racing, and for the first time in years, Rebecca felt truly alone. In that moment, she realized that the man she had spent over a decade with was no longer someone she recognized. He had become a stranger, someone who had shattered the life they had built together, and there was no way to undo it. That night, as Rebecca lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. The quiet ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo in her mind, counting down the minutes, counting down the hours until she would have to confront the reality of what was happening. Her body felt stiff and cold, as though the very act of betrayal had leached the warmth from her. Tom, lying beside her, slept soundly, his breath steady and calm. He seemed so innocent, so unaware of the storm raging inside her. But that was the thing about betrayal. It changed everything. How could she possibly sleep next to him after what she had discovered? How could she pretend that things were the same when everything was now so clearly broken? The anger within Rebecca grew over the following days. She was consumed by it. She couldn't stop thinking about Chloe, how the betrayal had been so deliberate, so cruel. The letter she had found was only the beginning. It wasn't just the affair that hurt, it was everything that had come before. The secret meetings, the hidden phone calls, the stolen moments. Chloe had been a part of Tom's life in a way that Rebecca had never imagined. She had been an intimate part of their family, and yet, she had chosen to stab Rebecca in the back, to destroy the bond they had once shared. Rebecca had always been fiercely protective of her sister. They had grown up together, two peas in a pod, always there for each other. Chloe had been the one Rebecca turned to during the hard times, after their mother died, after Rebecca had suffered a miscarriage, after the fights she'd had with Tom. Chloe had been her sounding board, her rock. And now, that rock had crumbled into dust, leaving Rebecca with nothing but the wreckage of their relationship. What hurt the most, Rebecca thought, was the way Chloe had justified her actions. From the letter, it was clear that Chloe felt no guilt, no shame. Instead, there was a sense of entitlement, a belief that she deserved to have what Rebecca had. It was as though Chloe had decided that her own happiness mattered more than the decades of love and loyalty they had shared. The thought of it twisted in Rebecca's stomach, a knot that refused to loosen no matter how hard she tried. She began to replay every conversation she had ever had with Chloe, trying to see the signs, to make sense of the subtle shifts in their relationship that now felt so painfully obvious. There had been moments, looking back, when Chloe had acted strangely. When she would show up unannounced at Rebecca's house, or when Tom would go out of his way to make sure he was busy during family events. Rebecca had written them off at the time, attributing them to nothing more than coincidence or misunderstanding. But now, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and they painted a chilling picture of betrayal and deceit. Rebecca's mind raced with the question of why. Why Chloe? Why Tom? It wasn't as though they had been unhappy. Rebecca and Tom had their issues, sure, like any couple. They fought, they disagreed, but they always worked things out. They had always believed in the value of compromise, of putting their family first. So how had everything gone so wrong? Was it the stress of work? Was it the strain of raising a teenager? Or was it something deeper, something about their characters that Rebecca had never seen before? As the days dragged on, Rebecca found herself consumed by her need for answers. She couldn't move forward until she understood why this had happened. She couldn't forgive them, couldn't even consider it, until she had the truth. And so, with a burning sense of determination, she decided she would confront them both. She would force them to admit the extent of their betrayal, to answer for what they had done to her, to their family, to the life they had all built together. It was a decision born from a mixture of rage and heartbreak, but it felt like the only way to regain some sense of control. She would demand an explanation. She would make them face the consequences of their actions. And perhaps, in doing so, she would find the answers she had been searching for. And so, after days of stewing in her anger, Rebecca finally decided to take action. She would invite Chloe over, under the guise of wanting to talk, to understand what had driven her to do this, to make her see the pain she had caused. She wasn't sure what she would do after that. Maybe she would get an apology. Maybe she would get the truth. Or maybe, just maybe, she would get something even more dangerous, the answer to the one question that haunted her. How far is she willing to go to make them pay for what they had done? Rebecca's resolve began to crystallize during the long, sleepless nights after her discovery. The pain of the betrayal had morphed into something else, something more primal, more destructive. She could no longer live with the quiet rage festering inside her, nor could she continue to act as though nothing had happened. She knew that confronting Chloe and Tom would not be easy, that it would be messy and perhaps even dangerous, but she also understood that it was the only way forward. She had to break the silence. She had to force the truth into the open, even if it meant tearing apart the fragile remnants of her once perfect life. In the days following the discovery, Rebecca had already gone through 1,000 variations of how she would approach the situation. At first, she considered simply confronting Tom alone, demanding he explain himself, perhaps with Chloe present to hear the full weight of her anger. But after some reflection, Rebecca realized that the real betrayal came from Chloe. Chloe had been the one who had crossed the line first, who had orchestrated this betrayal with calculated intent. She needed to be the one to face Rebecca's wrath head-on. Rebecca hadn't spoken to Chloe in days, but she knew that the longer she waited, the harder the conversation would become. Chloe had to know that Rebecca was no fool, that she had seen through the veil of their lies. But what would Chloe say? Would she apologize? Would she try to justify her actions? Or would she continue to deny the gravity of her betrayal, blaming Rebecca for something she had no control over? The idea of confronting Chloe was, in itself, terrifying. It was one thing to be angry at Tom. Their marriage had always had its issues, and he was, after all, still a man who could be reasoned with, at least to some degree. But Chloe, her sister, the one person who had always been there for her, that was something altogether different. Their bond had been so close, so sacred, and Rebecca could never have imagined a time when she would have to look at Chloe and see nothing but a stranger. But that was where she was now, standing at the precipice of the most devastating conversation of her life, uncertain of how she would navigate the emotional landmine she was about to step into. The afternoon of the confrontation arrived, and Rebecca stood at her kitchen window, watching the light begin to fade as the sun dipped below the horizon. She had invited Chloe over earlier that day, under the guise of wanting to talk. She had tried to make it sound as neutral as possible. She needed Chloe to come to her without suspicion, without preparation. She needed her to feel like everything was normal. But Rebecca knew better than anyone that nothing would ever be normal again. The truth was already out, and there was no way to undo it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway, the crunch of tires against the dirt. She turned and saw Chloe's car pull into the driveway, its headlights casting long shadows across the front yard. It was just after 5, and Chloe had promised to be there by 6. She had arrived early, perhaps sensing the urgency in Rebecca's invitation. She got out of the car, her posture stiff and uncertain, as if she, too, could feel the weight of what was about to transpire. Rebecca took a deep breath and forced herself to walk toward the door. She couldn't back out now. She had come too far. "Hi, Rebecca," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes, and Rebecca immediately noticed the subtle tension in her sister's body language, the way her shoulders were drawn up tight, as if she were bracing herself for something. "Chloe," Rebecca replied, her voice colder than she intended.
"Come in."
They walked into the living room, where Rebecca gestured to the couch. Chloe sat down hesitantly, still not fully aware of the storm that was about to hit her. Rebecca stood by the window for a moment, trying to steady her nerves. She had rehearsed what she would say 100 times, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed to disappear from her mind. Finally, she turned and faced her sister. Chloe was still sitting there, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something to hold onto. Rebecca could feel the silence stretching out between them, suffocating her. "Do you know why I asked you to come here?" Rebecca's voice was steady, though the anger still lurked beneath the surface. It was a question meant to test Chloe, to see how much she was willing to acknowledge. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking to the floor. She had to know that the jig was up. I'm not sure what you mean. You said you wanted to talk, and I thought. "I think you know exactly what I mean," Rebecca interrupted, her words sharp and biting. "You and Tom, the affair, the lies." Chloe's face went pale. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. For a moment, she looked as though she might try to deny it, but then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a heavy sigh. The defeat in her posture was palpable. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca," Chloe finally whispered. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, Rebecca thought she might actually break down in front of her. "I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted it to be like this." Rebecca felt a flash of disgust and betrayal, but she held herself steady. "Never meant to hurt me? Chloe, you've been lying to me for months. You've been sleeping with my husband. You've been tearing apart everything I've built." Her voice broke, and the tears she had been fighting so hard to keep at bay began to form, stinging the back of her eyes. But she wouldn't let them fall. Not yet. Chloe's face crumpled with guilt, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know how it happened," she said, her voice muffled. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. It just happened." Rebecca's jaw clenched. "You're telling me it just happened? After everything we've been through together? After all the years I've spent trusting you? That's your excuse." Chloe's sobs became more desperate, and for a moment, Rebecca considered walking over to comfort her sister. But the thought repulsed her. How could she? How could she comfort the person who had destroyed her life? "You can't possibly understand, Rebecca," Chloe continued, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Tom and I," she hesitated, as if unsure of how much to say, but Rebecca didn't care. She didn't want to hear the excuses. She didn't want to hear any more of Chloe's rationalizations. "You've already said enough," Rebecca replied coldly. "And let me tell you something, Chloe. This is not something that can be forgiven. You don't get to just waltz back into my life like nothing happened." Chloe's face twisted with a mixture of confusion and shame. "Rebecca, please.
Please don't say that.
I've already hurt you more than you can imagine. But I'm asking for your forgiveness, For both of us. For me and for Tom. We didn't mean to ruin everything. Rebecca's heart raced. The coldness inside her deepened. She couldn't forgive. She couldn't forget. What they had done was too deep, too devastating. There were no words that could undo the damage, no apology that could make things right. But the part of her that was still tethered to her humanity, the part of her that still loved her sister despite everything, wanted to reach out. But she couldn't. Not yet.
Not now.
Chloe's betrayal had torn away the last shred of innocence in their relationship. "You've already made your choice, Chloe," Rebecca said, her voice trembling with anger. "And I've made mine. But don't think for a second that your actions don't have consequences. I will never be the same after this. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you." Chloe sat frozen, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and remorse. Rebecca stood up and turned toward the door.
She needed air. She needed to breathe.
The walls of the house, of her life, felt suffocating. "Rebecca," Chloe's voice was small, fragile. "Please don't shut me out.
I'm sorry.
I never meant for things to get this far." But Rebecca didn't answer. She couldn't, because the moment the truth had been revealed, everything had changed. There was no going back. The confrontation with Chloe had left Rebecca reeling, but it had also driven her into a state of harsh clarity. She had spent years building a life based on trust, love, and loyalty, only to have it torn apart in a matter of weeks. What remained now was a shattered version of herself, someone unrecognizable even to her. The person she had been, the devoted wife, the loving sister, seemed to have evaporated into thin air, leaving a hollow shell of anger and betrayal. The weight of her emotions felt like a heavy cloak, one she couldn't remove no matter how hard she tried. Rebecca had tried to pretend, at first, that she could continue on as if things would return to normal after a confrontation with Chloe. That maybe, if she just buried the pain, it would all go away. She imagined that with time, she could push through, forcing herself to focus on the mundane, to continue being the mother Lily needed, the housewife that Tom expected. But no matter how hard she tried to carry on with her day-to-day tasks, the truth always loomed over her, reminding her that she could never go back to the life she had known. She couldn't force herself to be the same person she had been before. The days after Chloe left her home felt suffocating. Rebecca found herself increasingly withdrawn, her mind spinning in a fog of confusion. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her with every passing moment, as though they were closing off the only reality she had ever known. Her thoughts were a blur of anger, pain, and a sense of profound loss. The anger toward Chloe for betraying her was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the venomous hatred she felt toward Tom. How could he, the man she had trusted with everything, the father of her child, have been complicit in this? He had thrown away the very foundation of their relationship, leaving her to pick up the pieces of something that could never be repaired. Rebecca tried to talk to Tom after the confrontation with Chloe, but the conversation had been equally devastating. Tom had apologized, of course. He had begged for forgiveness, promised that it was a mistake, that it was something that had just happened. But the words felt hollow to Rebecca. She had heard them too many times from him, from men who made excuses to justify their infidelities. Just happened. How could something as intimate, as deliberate as an affair, just happen? It was the same empty excuse he had given her when she had confronted him earlier, and it only fueled her rage. But as the days turned into weeks, Rebecca realized that the anger she had been drowning in was starting to burn out. It was still there, of course, under the surface, lurking, but it was no longer all-consuming. Anger, she found, was exhausting. The rage that had once felt so necessary, so righteous, was now a weight that she was growing too tired to carry. She had to face the reality of what had happened, and to do so, she would need to find a new path forward. But that path wasn't clear. In fact, it felt like she was walking through fog, unsure of where each step might lead her. At first, Rebecca had tried to return to her usual routine. She made the same breakfasts, cleaned the same floors, and did everything she could to maintain the semblance of normalcy for Lily. But as much as she tried to play the part of the perfect mother, it was becoming impossible. Lily, who had been the one bright spot in her life, had started to notice the changes in her mother. She wasn't as patient, as cheerful, as engaged as she used to be. The once comforting rhythm of their life together had been disrupted, and Rebecca could feel the growing distance between them. It wasn't just the betrayal that was damaging her, it was the way it was now reverberating through every aspect of her life, threatening to undo the relationship with the one person she loved above all others. Lily was a bright, sensitive teenager, and Rebecca could see the confusion in her daughter's eyes when she tried to make small talk, when she tried to keep things as normal as possible. Lily was used to seeing her mother as someone who could handle anything, someone who made everything work. But now, Rebecca was falling apart, and she couldn't pretend that everything was okay anymore. It broke her heart to see the worry in Lily's eyes, but it also ignited a new sense of purpose in Rebecca. She needed to hold it together for Lily. She needed to be strong, not for Tom, not for Chloe, but for the only person who had always been there for her without question. It was the first time that Rebecca began to realize that while she couldn't go back to her old life, she didn't need to. She didn't need to play the role of the dutiful wife or the ever-supportive sister anymore. Those personas were gone. And while it was terrifying to think about living a different life, one that didn't revolve around the narrative she had built for herself, Rebecca also began to see a possibility. What if she could carve out a new life for herself, one that was entirely hers? It was during a particularly difficult day, when Rebecca had stayed in bed all afternoon, staring at the ceiling, that the thought hit her like a sudden gust of wind. She could leave. She had the power to make a new beginning, to take control of her own story. It wasn't an easy choice, far from it. But the more Rebecca considered it, the more it began to make sense. Staying in a relationship that had been built on lies, staying in a house that no longer felt like home, wasn't going to bring her peace. It wasn't going to heal her. So, over the course of the next few days, Rebecca began to take small steps toward making that decision. It was in her own quiet moments, when she was sitting at the kitchen table, or when she was folding laundry in the late evenings, that she found herself imagining a future without Tom, without Chloe, without the constant reminders of what had been stolen from her. There was something terrifying, yes, about the unknown future that awaited her, but there was also a strange sense of liberation in it. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Rebecca took out her phone and made a list. It was a list of everything she needed to do to leave. To leave Tom, to leave the life they had built together, and to forge a new identity for herself. It was a simple list, but it was a turning point. She had already begun thinking about what her next steps would be, and now it was just a matter of executing them. The list wasn't long. It included things like getting a lawyer, finding a new place to live, and starting to save money. There were practical matters, but there were also emotional ones. She needed to begin letting go of the anger that had consumed her. She needed to forgive herself for allowing this to happen, for trusting Tom, for trusting Chloe. She needed to stop seeing herself as a victim, as someone who had lost everything. She needed to see herself as someone who could rebuild. That was perhaps the hardest part, learning to forgive herself. For weeks, Rebecca had blamed herself. How could she not have seen it coming? How had she let her guard down? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't her fault. This was a betrayal that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the choices that Tom and Chloe had made. And as long as she continued to blame herself, she would remain trapped in a cycle of anger and regret. The days after her realization were filled with a mixture of fear, excitement, and confusion. Rebecca was walking a tightrope between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. She wasn't sure where this path would take her, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The weight of her anger had started to lift, replaced by the quiet determination that, while her life had been shattered, it wasn't over. Rebecca wasn't going to allow this betrayal to define her any longer. She had the power to redefine herself, to choose who she would become in the aftermath of everything. And as she stood at the edge of that unknown future, she realized that, perhaps, this was the beginning of something new, a life she could shape entirely on her own terms. Rebecca's decision to leave Tom, To forge a new path for herself and Lily felt like an act of liberation. In the days and weeks following her confrontation with Chloe, she had immersed herself in practicalities, contacting a lawyer, finding a small apartment, and gathering the financial means to leave the house that once symbolized everything she had worked for. Each step forward felt like a small victory, each one reinforcing her belief that she was finally reclaiming her life. The first few days in the apartment were filled with a strange, almost surreal sense of freedom. For the first time in a long while, Rebecca felt as though the weight of her past had been lifted off her shoulders. The apartment was small but clean, a modest one-bedroom place in a quiet part of town. It was bare, no furniture, no personal touches, but it was hers. It was a space where she could start over, a place that didn't carry the heavy memories of Tom's betrayal or Chloe's deceit. In those first few nights, after she tucked Lily into bed, Rebecca would sit on the floor, staring out of the window at the dark street below, wondering what it all meant. What did freedom really feel like? It was strange to be alone. For the first time in years, she didn't have to share space with Tom. She didn't have to walk on eggshells or try to hold it all together for him. It should have felt like relief, and in many ways, it did. The silence in the apartment was deafening at first, but over time, Rebecca came to appreciate it. It gave her room to breathe, room to think. She didn't have to pretend to be something she wasn't. The world was hers to navigate. But the feeling of relief was fleeting because, like all victories, it came with its price. The days began to blend together, and slowly, the cracks in the foundation of her newfound freedom started to show. At night, when the apartment was quiet and Lily had fallen asleep, the loneliness crept in. It wasn't just the absence of Tom, it was the absence of everything she had once known. The family dinners, the late-night talks with Chloe, the sense of security in knowing where her life was headed, all of it was gone, replaced by an emptiness that she hadn't anticipated. Rebecca spent those nights scrolling through old photos on her phone, looking at pictures of the life she had left behind. There were snapshots of her and Tom at family gatherings, photos of Chloe with Lily when she was younger, memories of a time when everything seemed perfect. She hadn't expected to miss those moments so much. She hadn't expected to feel the tug of nostalgia, the longing for a time that was forever lost. The weight of that loss was crushing, and it brought her to a place she didn't want to go: grief. She was grieving not only the dissolution of her marriage, but also the death of the woman she had been before the betrayal, before everything fell apart. As the weeks passed, Rebecca began to realize that she had been so focused on leaving that she hadn't thought about what it would mean to truly rebuild. She had expected that once she was free from Tom, once she had the apartment and the money, she would immediately feel whole again. But the truth was more complicated. The pieces of her life that had been scattered by Chloe's betrayal, by Tom's lies, couldn't just be picked up and rearranged. They were broken beyond repair, and there was no quick fix. No one had told her that healing wasn't a straight line. She had hoped, foolishly, that with each passing day, she would wake up to a life that felt like it made sense. But instead, each day felt like a slow, painful process of coming to terms with her new reality. Her sense of self, once defined by her role as wife and mother, now felt fractured. Who was she, really, without those roles? She had spent so much of her life giving herself to others, to Tom, to Lily, to Chloe, that she had lost sight of who Rebecca was at her core. In the early days of her separation, she tried to find herself again. She tried going out with old friends, reconnecting with her hobbies, even taking long walks around the neighborhood to clear her head. But no matter what she did, something always felt missing. She wasn't just mourning the loss of her marriage, but the loss of her identity, the person she had been before everything fell apart. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, Rebecca found herself sitting at her kitchen table, staring at a blank notebook. She had started journaling in an attempt to understand her feelings, to untangle the mess of emotions that had become her life. But tonight, the words wouldn't come. She picked up her pen, tried to write something meaningful, but it felt like the weight of her grief had taken her voice. She put the pen down and let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in her chair and closing her eyes. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to be furious with Tom, with Chloe, to unleash her rage in a way that would feel cathartic. But she was too tired. The anger that had once burned so brightly within her had simmered down to a quiet ache, a dull, persistent pain that never seemed to go away. The anger had been her fuel, her power, but now it had become something else entirely. It was like a weight she carried in her chest, reminding her that there were still so many questions left unanswered. Why had Tom done it? What had he been looking for in Chloe? Was there something missing in their marriage, something she had failed to see? And where did Chloe fit into all of this? Could she ever forgive her sister for what she had done? The truth was that Rebecca didn't have any answers, and that was what gnawed at her. She didn't have a clear path forward. For the first time in years, she felt adrift, like a ship lost at sea, with no shore in sight. Her desire for control, for a sense of certainty, had been shattered by the chaos of betrayal, and nothing in her life seemed to offer the answers she so desperately needed. The biggest shock, however, came from within. She had expected that leaving Tom would fix everything. She had expected that once she had removed herself from the toxicity of their marriage, she would feel whole again. But in truth, the divorce had only revealed how fragile her sense of self had been all along. Without the familiar structure of her old life, Rebecca was left to face the reality of who she had become, a woman who had been so wrapped up in her marriage, in her role as a mother, that she had forgotten who she was with. Those labels. And so, as the days turned into weeks, Rebecca realized that what she had initially thought of as a victory, leaving Tom, starting fresh, was, in many ways, just the beginning of an even harder journey. The false victory was not in the physical separation from Tom or the freedom of living on her own, but in the belief that those actions alone would be enough to heal the wounds. She had underestimated the depth of her pain and the complexity of her emotional landscape. Healing wasn't something that could be done overnight. It wasn't about packing up your things and moving to a new space. It wasn't about putting up walls and pretending everything was okay. It was about facing the truth of who you were, of what you had lost, and finding a way to make peace with it. That was the bitter realization that Rebecca faced in the quiet moments of her new life. She had thought that leaving Tom was the answer, that the simple act of cutting ties would allow her to move on.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.